Out on the flat black soil ground of northeast Nebraska, there is a kind of quiet that only farm country knows. Wind moving through corn stalks, a screen door slapping shut, a dog barking once, then giving up. It was in that kind of quiet, back in the summer of 1979, that Walter Dekker built a fence nobody asked him to build. He was 61 years old that year, broad through the shoulders, the way men get from 40 years of pitching hay and setting fence posts, with hands so calloused his own grandchildren said, shaking them felt like gripping a fence rail. His people had come over from Friesland, in the Netherlands, 3 generations back, and settled this same quarter section of ground outside a town so small it didn't have a stoplight. The Dekker well had been drilled in 1931 by Walter's own father, sunk 60 feet down through clay and sand, until it struck a vein of water so clean and cold that neighbors used to drive out just to fill jugs from it during dry summers. For 48 years, that well had no fence at all, just a pump house, a concrete pad, and a hand pump that squeaked on the upstroke. Kids climbed on it. Dogs slept in its shade. It was as ordinary a fixture on the Dekker farm as the clothesline or the corn crib. Then, in the spring of 1979, Walter did something that made half the township talk. He fenced it. Not just a token wire either. A proper 4-foot woven wire fence with a gate that latched, set a full 8 feet back from the well casing in every direction, enclosing the pump house completely. He poured a new concrete collar around the wellhead himself, working alone on a Saturday with a wheelbarrow and a bag mixer, and he raised the casing pipe another 2 feet above the pad before he capped it. His neighbor, a big cheerful man named Roy Pemberton who farmed the section to the east, leaned on that new fence one evening and asked him straight out, "Walter, you afraid one of the grandkids is going to fall down the well? Because I'll tell you, in 50 years nobody's fallen down a well around here." Walter didn't answer right away. He never did. He was the kind of man who chewed on a thought before he let it out of his mouth, the way you'd work a piece of gristle before swallowing it. Finally he said, "Not the kids I'm worried about, Roy. It's what comes with the water when the water comes wrong." Roy laughed. The way you laugh at something you don't understand and don't feel like asking twice about, and went back to his own chores. And that was the answer everyone settled on, because it was the easiest one. Old Walter Dekker, they said, had gotten overly cautious in his older years, safety-minded, maybe a little strange. His late wife, Anneka, had passed 2 winters before, and grief does funny things to a man alone in a farmhouse. People decided the fence was grief, wearing the shape of caution, and they let it be. Nobody asked the real question, which was why a man who had never once worried about safety in 40 years would suddenly spend a week's wages on fencing that didn't protect a single soul from falling in. Walter's granddaughter, Emma, was 11 that summer, sent out from Lincoln to spend her break on the farm the way her mother had done as a girl. Emma was the kind of child who noticed things adults had stopped noticing, the way children do before the world teaches them not to. She noticed that her grandfather checked the well casing every single morning before breakfast, running his palm along the pipe like he was reading it. She noticed that he kept a small spiral notebook in his coat pocket, and that some evenings he'd sit at the kitchen table with a folded county map, tracing lines across it with a pencil. Lines that seemed to follow the low ground and the drainage ditches that cut through Dekker land toward the creek. She asked him about it once, sitting on the porch shelling peas. "Grandpa, what are you drawing on that map?" "Water," he said. "Where it wants to go when it's got nowhere else to go." That was as much as he'd say. But he started teaching her things that summer, the way old farmers teach, without seeming to be teaching at all. He showed her how the well casing rose above the concrete pad, and told her that was on purpose, not an accident of construction. He showed her the sanitary cap sealed tight over the top, with its small screened vent facing down toward the ground so no insects or floodwater could work their way in from above. He told her, in that same unhurried voice, that somewhere down inside that pipe, past where the eye could see, there was a wide ring of grout packed in around the outside of the casing, clay and cement forced down into the space between the pipe and the raw earth of the borehole. "What's that for?" she asked. "Keeps the wrong water out," he said. "Rain that's touched the barnyard, or the ditch, or worse, can run right down the outside of a pipe, same as down the inside, if you let it. That grout is the difference between a well that gives you good water for 100 years and one that poisons a family in a single afternoon. Emma didn't fully understand it then. She understood it as a story about pipes and clay, the kind of dry farm fact that adults seem to care about for reasons children couldn't access. But she remembered it, the way children remember the strange and specific things their grandparents tell them, tucked away for a use she couldn't yet imagine. What none of the neighbors knew, what Walter had never told a living soul except, in pieces, his granddaughter, was that he had lost something to a well once before. Not this well, a different one, 40 years earlier, on his Uncle Peter's farm 2 counties over, back in the terrible flood spring of 1943, when weeks of snowmelt and April rain had turned the whole river bottom into a brown, moving lake. Peter Dekker's well had been an old one, shallow and poorly cased, the kind common enough on farms settled in the early part of the century before anyone understood what ran downhill and where it ended up. When the floodwater rose that spring, it rose right over the top of that wellhead and sat there for the better part of 2 weeks, seeping down around a casing that barely stood a foot above the ground. Nobody thought much of it at the time. The water receded, the pump still worked, and life on a hard-pressed wartime farm didn't leave much room for testing what looked like clean water coming out of a familiar spigot. 3 of Peter's children fell sick within days of each other that June. It was young Walter, 17 at the time, staying with his uncle's family for the planting season, who rode 12 miles on a borrowed bicycle to fetch the doctor. The doctor, when he finally traced the illness back, found what he suspected all along. The well had been overrun by floodwater carrying runoff from the barnyard and a leaking privy vault upslope, and the bacteria in that water, organisms with names like Escherichia coli and Salmonella, invisible in a glass, tasteless on the tongue, had done what floodwater bacteria have always done to farm families who trusted a well that looked the same as it always had. One of Peter's children did not recover. A boy of 5, gone inside of 10 days from what the doctor at the time simply called the summer sickness, a phrase that meant almost nothing and explained almost everything. Walter carried that spring with him for the rest of his life. He carried it quietly, the way his generation carried most things, folded down small and put away where it wouldn't show. But he never again looked at a well the same way. He went on to spend a good part of his working life reading up on well construction wherever he could find it. Extension bulletins from the university, a well driller's manual he kept on a shelf next to his Bible, conversations with the county health inspector that lasted longer than the inspector probably wanted. He learned, decades before it was common knowledge on farms like his, that a well casing needed to stand well clear of the highest flood level ever recorded on that ground, not just clear of an ordinary rain. He learned that the space between casing and borehole, the annulus, had to be sealed floor to nearly the surface with grout, or floodwater would find its way down the outside of even a good pipe like water, finding a crack in ice. He learned that a proper sanitary cap, tight and vermin-proof, was the last line of defense, and that fencing wasn't decoration. It was there to keep cattle, floating debris, and displaced fuel drums from battering a wellhead loose during high water, and to keep the ground immediately around the casing from being trampled into a churned, compacted funnel that would direct dirty runoff straight at the pipe instead of letting it drain wide and slow through healthy sod. By the time he fenced his own well in 1979, Walter Dekker wasn't being cautious for caution's sake. He was applying, quietly and without explanation, 40 years of hard-won knowledge to a piece of ground he loved, on a farm where the creek had been running high every spring for 3 years running, and where he had watched the drainage ditches cut deeper and faster every season as more of the surrounding land went under the plow. He never told Roy Pemberton any of this. He never told most of his own children. Grief he could talk about. This wasn't grief. This was something closer to a debt he owed a 5-year-old boy who had been dead for 36 years, paid out in concrete and grout and galvanized wire. The flood came in March of 1981, 2 years after the fence went up. It wasn't a hurricane or a wall of water the way floods look in movies. It was worse in its way, because it was slow and patient and total. An unusually heavy snowpack sat on the ground through February. Then 10 days of warm rain fell on top of it in early March, and every ditch, culvert, and low field in 3 counties filled and kept filling. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Dekker land, normally a modest thing you could jump across in August, swelled into a brown, debris-choked river a quarter-mile wide. It came up over the pasture, over the lower cornfields, and crept, inch by patient inch, toward the farmyard itself. Roy Pemberton's place, lower lying than Walter's, took the worst of it. His well, an older one with a casing that barely cleared the ground, went under floodwater entirely for the better part of a week. So did 3 other wells along that stretch of the creek. At the Dekker place, the water rose high enough to lap at the base of the new fence Walter had built 2 years before. It stood there, dark and swirling, carrying fence posts and a drowned calf, and someone's plastic fuel drum from 3 farms upstream, all of it pressing up against that woven wire. But the wire held the debris back, a full 8 feet from the wellhead itself, and the casing Walter had raised 2 feet higher than code even required stood clear of the water's surface the entire time, its sanitary cap dry and sealed above the floodline, even at its highest crest. When the water finally receded 2 weeks later, the difference between the Dekker farm and half a dozen of its neighbors became plain enough for the whole county to see. Roy Pemberton's well tested positive for coliform bacteria, the telltale sign of surface contamination, and his family spent nearly a month boiling every drop of water they drank, cooked with, or gave to their livestock, waiting on a proper shock chlorination treatment and a fresh round of testing before the health department would clear the well again. 2 other farms along the creek weren't so lucky even with boiling. One family came down with the kind of stomach illness that sends grown men to the hospital on an IV drip, traced straight back to well water that had looked, right up until the day it made them sick, exactly like it always had. The Dekker well tested clean on the very first pass. That was the moment the fence stopped being a strange old man's quirk and became the thing people talked about at the co-op and after church for years afterward. Roy Pemberton himself came around one warm April evening, once his own well was finally cleared, and stood at that same gate he'd leaned on 2 years before, except this time he didn't ask a mocking question. He asked a real one. "How'd you know, Walter?" And this time, standing in the mud with the fence line still marking the high water stain from 3 weeks earlier, Walter finally told him. He told him about Peter's farm in 1943, and the boy who never made it out of June. He told him about the casing height, the grouting, the sanitary cap, the fence that wasn't there to stop a fall, but to stop a flood from ever reaching what it wanted to reach. He told it plainly, the way he told most things, without asking for pity, and without much emotion in his voice at all. Though Emma, standing nearby with a bucket of eggs on her hip, saw her grandfather's jaw working the way it did when he was holding something back. By the following spring, 4 farms along that creek had raised their casings, poured new collars, and fenced their wellheads the way Walter had. The county extension office used the Dekker well as a standing example for a good decade afterward, driving visiting farmers out to look at a piece of fencing that had quietly done exactly what it was built to do. Emma Dekker is in her 50s now, and she still owns that same quarter section, the well still capped and fenced the way her grandfather left it, though the wire has been replaced twice since. She tells the story to her own grandchildren the way it was told to her, on the porch, shelling peas if the season allows for it, and she ends it the same way every time. Her grandfather didn't build that fence because he was afraid of what might fall in. He built it because he already knew what could come up out of the ground and take everything from a family in the space of 10 days, and he had spent 40 years making sure it never happened to his own. The neighbors who laughed at him weren't foolish for laughing. They simply hadn't paid the price he'd already paid, and hadn't yet learned what a fence around a well was really guarding against. Sometimes the quietest precautions on a farm carry the heaviest history behind them. And sometimes the old man everyone thinks is being overly careful is the only one who actually remembers why the caution exists in the first place. If a fence like that stands on ground, go take a look at it sometime. Ask why it's there. You might be surprised at the story a piece of wire and concrete can hold.